Hi, good day for intercontinental participants and viewers. This is the day 2 of our EU-Asia project annual workshop, the geopolitics and economics of technology in the Indo-Pacific. And panel number 5, the economy, security nexus, the rare metals and semiconductors. My name is Ken Endo, professor at the Hokkaido University, Japan, and part-time professor at the European University Institute. This EU-Asia project is a flagship project at the EUI Robert Schuman Center, which Julio and I have launched since last year. The original plan was to invite all of you to the beautiful city of Florence, or the uphill of the Fiesole, in the scenery of Toscana color. But anyway, the COVID-19 has prevented us from getting together. A pity, but perhaps next year. Now, this session focuses on rare metals and semiconductors, and always in mind the concrete region of Indo-Pacific. First, we invite Madoka Fukuda, Hosei University, Japan, to set the scene. She is the expert of international relations involving Taiwan, US, China, and Japan, and the author of a prize-winning book, The PRC's Diplomacy and Taiwan, The Origin of the One China Principle. Now, after that, we go into somewhat concrete details. The Eugene Gholz talks about rare earths, followed by Chien-Huei on semiconductor. The Eugene Gholz is associate professor of political science at the University of Notre. He works on the nexus of security and an economy, innovation, defense management, and the US grand strategy, particularly notably of restraint. Chien-Huei is a EUI alumni, a friend of mine from those days, currently the associate research fellow at the prestigious Academia Sinica at Taipei. As you know, Taiwan is the key country as regards the semiconductor telecommunication at the heart of the supply chain. Dr. Wu is a legal expert of export control, WTO, and the EU, best qualified to talk on supply chain and export control of semiconductor. And finally, but not least, we are fortunate to have TJ Pempel as a commentator. As we all know, he's a professor at the UC Berkeley, specialized in Japan's politics, Eastern Asian international relations. So each speaker has 10 minutes, and the commentator TJ has 15 minutes. So Madoka, can you start, please? I will send some signals if time runs out through chat.
Okay, I will share my slides, and actually I prepared my presentation for 15 minutes, so so I have to apologize before my presentation. Okay, but I will try to make it short. Okay, can you see my slides? Okay, so
you can put in full screen the window of your PowerPoint. just to see bigger. Okay, nice.
Okay. Okay, today I will present about Japan-Taiwan cooperation in the area of economic security, especially about strengthening semiconductor supply chains. Since the Kishida administration took office last fall in Japan, Japan has been rapidly debating economic security as the centerpiece of the administration's policies. Okay. The House of Representatives has begun deliberations on the Economic Security Promotion Bill at its current plenary session. The bill has 4 pillars, especially securing a stable supply of semiconductors and rebuilding Japanese semiconductor industry is an urgent task for the Japanese government. Behind the rapid progress of economic security, there are changes in the international environment. First, the US-China competition developed into tensions over technological hegemony, the most prominent of which was the issue of semiconductors. In response to this impact, countries strengthened policies to encroach important industrial bases from the perspective of economic security. In Japan and Taiwan, the focus was reassessing excessive dependence on China and avoiding the risk of being caught up in US-China competition. And as tensions over technological hegemony increased between the United States and China, the tug of war over Taiwanese semiconductor companies intensified. In particular, the US government asked the TSMC to stop doing businesses with Huawei and build a new plant in the US. In 2020, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the above trend. The pandemic led to the rapid digitalization of society, which in turn greatly expanded the demand for the semiconductors. In addition, even during the COVID pandemic, China hasn't relaxed its military, diplomatic, and political offensive in neighboring regions. China's repression of civilian movements in Hong Kong and human rights abuses in Xinjiang have become global problems. Multinational corporations' operations in China are being questioned about their position on human rights issues. Furthermore, Taiwan and Japan had to consider the risk of a military crisis with China. And the ongoing Ukraine crisis has reminded both Japan and Taiwan of the importance of being prepared for the above risks. Both the Japanese and Taiwanese governments expressed their firm intention to join the economic sanctions against Russia. At the same time, they had to rotate energy supplies and price stability. Under these circumstances, governments became increasingly aware of strengthening the supply chains for goods essential to their industries, particularly semiconductors. Japan's semiconductor industry has gradually declined in stature since the 1990s. Japan cannot design and plan advanced logic semiconductors, and its production capacity is low. However, Japanese companies are competitive in memory, sensors, and power semiconductors outside of logic semiconductors. In addition, Japan is still one of the most competitive countries in semiconductor materials and manufacturing equipment. The US-China competition over technology is forcing Japan's semiconductor industry, like other countries, to rethink its dependence on China in the supply chain. According to the Japan Foreign Trade Council, in 2020, Japan's main export destinations for electronic components such as semiconductors were China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. In addition, the main export destinations for semiconductor manufacturing equipment were China, Taiwan, and South Korea. On the other hand, Japan's main import destinations for electronic components were Taiwan and China. If imports and exports to and from China are reviewed, the importance of imports and exports from Taiwan to Japan will naturally increase. In light of these risks and opportunities, in June 2021, the Japanese METI outlined a three-pronged strategy to revive Japan's semiconductor industry. The first pillar of the strategy is to restore the manufacture of advanced logic semiconductors. The government has committed to attracting advanced semiconductor foundries overseas by providing substantial subsidies. The second pillar is to strengthen further the supply capacity of semiconductors other than logic semiconductors. The third pillar aims to enhance further its international competitiveness in semiconductor materials and manufacturing equipments. The Japanese government's strategy is already being implemented. In October 2021, TSMC announced its plan to build a semiconductor plant in Kumamoto, Japan. TSMC will not produce the most advanced semiconductors in Japan. However, they are more advanced than the logic semiconductors that have been made in Japan until now. The success of this attraction is due to TSMC's relationship with the University of Tokyo and Tsukuba City. The Japanese side expects TSMC to supply semiconductors and promote joint research for more advanced technologies. Taiwanese companies are currently the world's top players in semiconductor production. According to the Taiwanese Ministry of Economic Affairs, Taiwanese foundries accounted for 70% of the global market share, with TSMC accounting for 50% in 2020. The attraction of TSMC factories to the United States and Japan is also meant to disperse the risks of such concentration of production bases. However, 90% of TSMC's production capacity is in Taiwan, and it has begun mass production of more advanced semiconductors. So Taiwanese dominance in semiconductor production will not be shaken shortly. Since the 2000s, the growth of the high-tech industry in mainland China has attracted many Taiwanese companies and talents. First, China accounts for a large proportion of the market for Taiwanese semiconductor companies. China accounts for a large proportion of Taiwan's semiconductor exports. China is also a substantial production base for semiconductors, with major companies such as TSMC and AUMC having factories in China. China is also attractive to Chinese engineers and scientists as a place to work or change jobs. As a result of the conflict between the United States and China, Chinese companies increasingly recruit human resources from Taiwanese companies. In light of this current situation, the Taiwanese government has implemented policies to support companies to return from mainland China since 2019. Furthermore, in 2021, the government has announced a policy to strengthen research and development in human resource development, materials, and technology, considering the future technological competition over semiconductors. In addition to expanding the industrial Park area in Hsinchu, the government also confirmed its plan to build an industrial park specializing in semiconductor materials in Kaohsiung in the southern part of the island. Taiwanese companies rely heavily on imports for semiconductor materials and production facilities. Many Japanese companies have a high global market share in semiconductor materials and production equipment. They have already expanded into Taiwan, playing an essential role in the Taiwanese semiconductor supply chain. Thus, when considering the restructuring of semiconductor supply chain from the perspective of both Japan and Taiwan, strengthening ties between Japan and Taiwan is a promising option for both sides, and strengthening ties are already beginning to take shape. For Japan, Taiwan is a reliable partner in catching up with global trends in logic semiconductor manufacturing. It could also be a research partner in developing more advanced technologies. On the other hand, Japan is an essential partner for Taiwan as a supplier of semiconductor materials and production equipment. And when considering the departure from dependence on China as a market and production base, it will be essential to strengthen the cooperation between Japan and Taiwan in the semiconductor industry. Japan and Taiwan have a long history of industrial cooperation. Japanese and Taiwanese companies worked together to expand their firms into mainland China in the 2000s. In recent years, they have sought to expand into Southeast and South Asian countries through collaboration. Supporting such collaboration, both governments conclude private agreements such as the Japan-Taiwan Investment Agreement. Both governments also have developed a mechanism for matching and dialogue between related companies and parties between Japan and Taiwan. For example, the Japan-Taiwan Industrial Cooperation Bridge Project is a framework for supporting small and medium-sized enterprises and economic organizations seeking to conduct exchanges to provide financial support and information. This framework is expected to be actively utilized in future cooperation in semiconductors. As a result, the Japan and Taiwan cooperation in the high-tech industry, particularly in semiconductors, will continue to develop under circumstances in which both governments have come to strengthen ties in economic security. I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to make you in a hurry, but it was great to have your view on the Japan-Taiwan sort of conviviality in the age of the US-China rivalries. Now, shall we ask Eugene Gholz to talk about the rare metals, please?
Sure.
10 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I look forward to the conversation. I wish we were in Fiesole. But so it goes. We're in the digital world now. So I'm gonna talk for a few minutes about rare earth elements. Just as a reminder, rare earth elements are 17 elements on the periodic table, 15 in the lanthanide series. They are they have wonderful properties where little bits of them influence the possibilities of the products around them. So sometimes people call them fairy dust, right? You need to put just a little bit of rare earth elements into a mix of an alloy, and you can benefit from their magnetic or fluorescent or sensing properties. So one thing to stress, the comparison to semiconductors, the rare earth elements market is tiny, right? The entire global market for rare earth elements is a couple $2 billion a year, right? It's like 10 minutes of a semiconductor foundry is the whole market for rare earths. But because they're like fairy dust, it doesn't take much to kind of make a difference to neat technologies that we're interested in. And they're a topic that people have talked about, political, geoeconomic manipulation in rare earths quite a lot, quite publicly, which is why, you know, maybe because it's such small scale, you have the illusion that you can manipulate it or you can understand it all. The last thing I'll say before I really get going is that I'm talking about rare earth elements. Rare metals is actually a different category. So like Russia is a major producer of rare metals, palladium and things like that, which are also very useful for different things, but they're in different quantities and a different market than rare earths, which are these 17. And that confusion, basically Russia is not a player in rare earths, for example. So just to quickly talk about the geopolitics and geoeconomics of rare earths, I'm going to break it down: supply, demand, supply, and then government, the role of government. On the demand side, you know, the old demand for rare earths going back to the 1980s was their fluorescent demand for fluorescence. So like they produced the color red in color television sets for many years. That was the main market for rare earths. That obviously faded a while ago. At that time, they were all produced essentially in the United States. The world has changed quite a bit. And we've seen predictions for more than a decade now that demand is just about to take off, right? People have thought the market is going to surge. So another way to talk about this, the current global market for rare earths is about 140,000 tons of rare earth oxides total across all 17 rare earths per year. So you could fit all of that on one container ship if you were trying, or it's a day of a large iron ore mine. But people have been predicting it's going to take off, and it actually hasn't for the last decade, but the predictions will come true if there's actually an energy transition. So if people switch to electric cars, there's going to be a lot more demand for rare earths. And so this is coming in some sense. People also are very concerned about rare earths because they are used in weapon systems, in defense products, both as sensors, and the rare earth magnets are very important in defense. But that demand is real, but it's actually small. So total global demand, or let's say, I know US figures. So US defense accounts for somewhere, it depends on the element, but let's say 4 to 5% of global demand. So it's a small fraction of the market. And there's lots of material sloshing around in the market relative to defense demand. So you don't have a real problem of not being able to make F-35s because of lack of access to rare earths. Another thing about the market is very opaque. Most transactions are private, in long-term private contracts. It's organized by brokers and trading houses. Japanese trading houses are particularly important in this, but they know suppliers and buyers and have private relationships with them. So we in general have no idea how much material is going from one supplier to one buyer and what price it's actually being sold at. So there are spot markets for rare earths, but they're tiny, and the prices in the spot markets are not very important in that overwhelmingly transactions for rare earths are not conducted at spot market prices, and their prices are not linked to spot market prices. So when you see reports that prices have surged on the spot market, ignore them, right? That's just somebody in a short run pinch trying to satisfy a tiny bit of demand. It's not important to the overall market. And the major development in demand lately has been, because of the electric vehicles transition, major automakers have started to arrange investments or offtake agreements or specific supply agreements with rare earth suppliers. And this is because it's complicated, because the automakers don't actually want rare earths. They want components that use rare earths. But because they want access to the rare earths, they've started to make these direct arrangements with rare earth companies. So like General Motors with MP Materials, the American rare earths manufacturer, so that the end user can ultimately supply rare earth material into its own supply chain. So it's some amount of vertical integration as a way to change the market. That's a new thing that is starting to happen. On the supply side, if we're going to talk about geoeconomics, we certainly want to talk about geography. And so these are the places where activity takes place in rare earths. So people worry about China. There's a lot of talk. China dominates the industry. Well, so China mines about 70% of rare earths. That gets you ore, but you need, for most applications, you need purified specific elements, separated, element by element among the 17, which is a chemically difficult process. The truth is, this is not a mining industry, it's a chemistry industry. And lots of separation happens in China. Again, it's hard to count, but maybe 90% of the global separation market right now is in China. And then magnet making, one of the particular applications are for these high strength magnets, particularly high strength, high temperature magnets that you can make in funny shapes. And a lot of that happens in China now. Now, Japan historically has been very powerful in this market. One of the two key patents for figuring out how to make magnets out of rare earths was a Japanese company's patent. And Japan is very active in other downstream uses. Japan does not produce rare earths in the sense of mining or separation, although they did in the past outside Japan. So Mitsubishi had a famous separation plant in Malaysia years ago, but Japan has been out of that business for decades. So Japan is a huge user. In Europe, there is actually some processing. Two of the major processing plants in the world are in Europe. They mostly process non-Chinese production, and Europe is involved in downstream uses of rare earths, making magnets and doing other things. Australia and the United States are the big producing competitors of China. And there are active mines in both Australia and the United States that each produce roughly 15% of global supply. There is processing that currently takes place in Australia and also owned by an Australian company in Malaysia. That's, again, a significant fraction of the market, 15% or so. In the United States, there has been processing in the past, and there will be again in the near future. There's real investment in processing. And again, in magnet making, the United States, the other main patent for the other way of making rare earth magnets was a US patent. And there's been magnet making, there continues to be magnet making in the US using imported material to make the magnets. And again, there are efforts to do much more magnet making in the United States. So there's actually more geographic distribution of supply than you would get from just reading the headlines in the newspapers. The role of the government. If this is going to be about geopolitics, you want to think about what the government does. Well, so in the past, foreign investment regulation was important in both the US and Australia. In basically, so the most relevant thing is in Australia, a Chinese company tried to buy the Australian mine early before it was producing, and it was blocked by the Australian government, maintaining some independence. In China, the government has subsidized the industry and has used quotas to encourage China's legal rare earths industry. And I stress that because something like a third of Chinese rare earths production is illegal mining outside the official position. It's highly mobbed up, organized crime runs it, and they smuggle a lot of the material. It makes it hard for the government to actually control the industry. Another big role of government is JOGMEC, a Japanese government entity or public-private partnership, however you want to phrase it, is a major investor in the Australian rare earths mine that's been important to bringing that mine to its current level of production. So it's been patient capital for the Australian rare earths industry. That was through brokering an arrangement between JOGMEC and Sojitz, the major Japanese trading house, which is the actual investor in Lynas, the Australian mine. But again, this role of Japanese companies as a broker related to the government has been very important in the industry. And finally, US and Japan have invested a lot in basic science in rare earths, including over the last 20 years, it's been going up. Okay, what about the present? How is this changing? Because people freaked out, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the 2010 Chinese embargo of rare earth sales to China. Well, so the United States in the last 2 years has actually, the US government has invested more than $100 million in the rare earth industry. So not in research, but in actually building production capacity. And this is weird for the United States, right? The US government doesn't usually do this a lot. And there's more money to come. This has become a popular industry in the United States because politicians can talk about it and it's been on the front pages. And when they say they want to stand up to China, very often they use rare earths as an example and they're putting money into it. Now, of course, they're also putting money in semiconductors now, but I'll leave that to others. The US has also banned the use of Chinese material and Chinese magnets in weapon systems. This is a transition. It's actually hard to prove where the materials are coming from, especially because they're smuggling. And so these bans are not yet enforced, but there's a real effort by the government to take China, to decouple from China. Japan, particularly since the pandemic, has subsidized reshoring of industry, including magnet production. They're trying to get Japanese companies that used to produce magnets in Japan, that over the last decade shifted a lot of production to China. They're now trying to get them to move it back to Japan. And this is actually not a hard sell, right? The companies can do this. And then in Europe, it's a very typical EU kind of thing. The EU is proposing consortia of companies to coordinate something, to invest, to be in economically depressed regions, to do this, to do that. There's a lot of talk, and we'll see if it amounts to anything. So I'm out of time, but I just want to raise the question, why is the government relevant to any of this? If the key issue is satisfying demand from the energy transition, private investors know about the energy transition, and there's lots of capital out there. So I'm not sure why, but the governments are throwing money at this industry, even though people know the industry has to grow and investors know they can make money in this industry. And so what'll happen, or what is happening, is government investment is crowding out private investment. And this is a typical problem with governments getting overeager and politicizing industries. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great, Eugene. Thank you very much indeed for your clarification of the sort of scope, scale, and character of the rare earth market and geo aspects of this market, as well as sort of activized role of the government with the demand increased and probably the importance as well. Now, I have to pronounce it well. Chien-Huei, is it fine? Please take the floor.
Okay. So, nice to meet you. It's unfortunate that I cannot meet you in Florence. Yeah, this is why I love to participate in this workshop. And the other reason is that I come from Taiwan. We talk about TSMC. And this, the other reason is I just published a book on export control. And you can see the COVID-19 changed everything. So it's a good time to make some promotion. So let's take a look about what economics says. Economics, they sometimes normally they make some assumptions, and these assumptions does not it's not always valid. So economics, they say the economics, it says Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. Well, probably Ukraine is more dangerous than. I don't want to compare that because it's always compared to Ukraine and Taiwan, unfortunately, because we have unfriendly neighbors. So this is the most dangerous place in Earth. And also, according to Bloomberg, it says that the world is dangerously dependent on Taiwan for semiconductor. And Taiwan, which China regards it as a province, is being caught for its capacity to making leading edge computer chips. So this is part of my presentation, economic nationalism or chip nationalism. So let's take a quick look about the geopolitics in East Asia. So we mentioned about the 2010 China rare earth case. It's in fact arise from the Japan-China conflict in Shinkaku Island, or for Chinese or Taiwanese, we call Diaoyutai Island conflicts. So in the end, China imposed export restrictions, and which in the end result in a China rare earth case in the WTO. And if we look at recently, Japan removed South Korea off the white list. After Republic of Korea, is a Supreme Court ruling on compensation of slave labor during the Second World War. And this case is also in the WTO right now. And as far as I know, I heard from the newspaper, Japan invoked national security exception. And then if we look at the relation between Taiwan, China, and the US, in 2020, the United Microelectronic Corps, which is the second largest semiconductor company in Taiwan, and the world largest number 4, it pleaded guilty in US criminal proceedings for its economic theft, and it did the UMC, which is a Taiwanese company, it did economic theft for Chinese company, which is called Fujian Chien-Huei. It's one of the pioneer chip company in China. So you see, some people in Taiwan, they did economic theft in US for Chinese company. So this is the situation, the tricky part of Taiwanese, because some of Taiwanese, they are working around US and China, and which makes it very difficult for a Taiwanese government to regulate its enterprise. So if we look tend to the time horizon in recent decades, I guess Trump changed a lot. One of the most important maxim for Trump is he says economic security is national security. So his plan is to industrialize the US. Then it comes the Huawei and 5G. And then in the context of semiconductor, as most of you know, it blocked the M&A, the acquisition between Broadcom and Qualcomm on the ground of national security concerns. This is called a CFIUS, or now is revised by FEMA Act. And recently, also in Trump administration, it revised the Export Control Act. And the main element there is foundational technology and critical infrastructures. And the Trump administration tried to clean out or screen out Chinese elements in critical infrastructures and also information technologies. And finally, in the final years of Trump administration, it emphasized on supply chain security. That's how Taiwanese semiconductor comes into play. And he also proposed clean network, try to screen out Huawei or Chinese elements. And in the end, as we know, COVID-19 comes and it changed everything. So how the pandemic changed everything? So if we shift from US to EU, and EU now is also focusing on what they call digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty. In the word of the current president of von der Leyen, she said that digital technology are transforming the world at an unprecedented speed. It changed the society and economics. So for European countries or European Union, it may be too late to replicate hyperscalers, but it is not too late to achieve technological sovereignty, which means the EU want to ensure its sufficiency instead of pursuing efficiency. If we borrow the wording of Professor Zheng, what he said yesterday. So we are seeing that the globe is moving from interdependence, or we are now in a process of feeling overdependence, and the sovereignty is coming back. So now the question for us is to reflect whether, if we focus so much on economic security, whether it signifies the end or at least the halt of economic globalization. And I just skipped this, and this is the Cold era for the export control and this economic divide between East and West. But what I want to mention is the final point. Tokyo and Washington, they are thinking about a multilateral framework to regulate the export, the control export technology to China. I missed A. This is the news from the US, from a Japanese newspaper. So how this initiate would turn out to be, we would have to watch carefully. So if we move beyond a multilateral framework and look into the domestic legislation, in US, there's a chip for America, and currently the FABS Act is under deliberation. And in the European context, there's a European Chip Act. And we just heard about how Japan tried to attract semiconductors, in particular TSMC, to go to Japan for investment. And this is the recent legislation. And so what are the in addition to these legislations, what are policy instruments? The first one is, of course, investment subsidy or incentives. But not all investment are welcome. So there's another way, which is like a Broadcom and Qualcomm case, the investment screening mechanism, trying to deter unwelcome investment, which is believed to undermine your national security. And then is export control regime, which is to preserve your technology advance to prevent the diffusion of technology. But in addition to these elements, there are other elements. So in Taiwan, especially the success of TSMC is not limited to its technology advance, but also because of its talents. So there's an element of how to attract talents or laborers in semiconductor enterprise. If TSMC invests in Arizona, the main difficulty is how to secure the supply of engineering. And finally, how to address or how to deter economic espionage or forced transfer to prevent technological diffusion or splits. So this is the ecosystem for Taiwanese semiconductors. The central one is mainly the middle part, the central one is mainly located in Taiwan. But other elements are outside Taiwan. The SMO, these are equivalents. And we also have a photo mask. And we also have chemicals in Japan. So this is why, if you look carefully for this graph, this chart, it makes sense for Taiwanese, for TSMC to go to Japan because of the chemicals. But in Taiwan, we have foundries, and we also have OSAT, which is assembly and packaging. But we have foundry, which is TSMC and UMC. But in Korea, they have a Samsung, and in US, it has Intel. But Intel is so-called IDM. It has from the upstream to downstream. But in Taiwan, TSMC is mainly focused on manufacturing. And when they manufacture the chips, the foundries, they would send to the OSAT for packaging and testing. And then they would deliver to the IC designer purchasers. And then for when the purchaser that would send it to ODM or EMS, which is something like a Foxconn, and in the end they would distribute to the Walmart, something. So basically, this is the ecosystem of Taiwan. If we understand this clearly, then we would know why TSMC goes to Japan or goes to Arizona, but I'm not sure whether it's beneficial to go to Europe. For Arizona, of course, the first important thing is political pressure. No one can resist the political pressure from US. I saw Professor Endo is smiling. I think a situation in Japan is the same. So, but in addition to political elements, there are some commercial elements. The first one is all these high technology equipment and software comes from US. If US impose its control on this element, then there's no game for TSMC. So that's why TSMC has to go to US. And there's another subsidy, not so much from US government, but in the end, the market potential is mainly for US military and strategic needs. The market is critical, but not for as much as commercial interest. But if we go to if you look at the Kumamoto case, the TSMC, they go to Japan is mainly for chemicals, and Japan provide good subsidies, and there's promising market potential in view of Japan's automobiles. But if we look at European market, it is doubtful whether the European market is sufficient, especially the need is mainly for automobile, which is not advanced processing. And we are not sure how much subsidy EU is willing to provide. And of course, that's limited way for EU to exert for political pressure. But finally, most important, there's insufficient supply of skilled laborers. So I just want to quickly go through this. For European countries or for Germany, the first advice I want to make is, why buy a car when you can get a meal for free? Why do you need a semiconductor enterprise by yourself? The reason for this is, why does the EU not have strong semiconductor sectors, especially in manufacturing sector? The reason is quite simple. This is comparative advantage. In Taiwan, the engineer, they take 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, but it is not possible in Europe. Not mentioned, it's not possible in Italy. My own word from Italian is piano and pazienza. There's no efficiency. And for German company, I would say the German company, they see dependence on Taiwan and its semiconductor as a threat. But I would say this is not the like my country's mindset. How can democratic countries constitute a threat to German enterprise? But on the other hand, German it greenlights a KUKA, but it put on a red light for Citrons, which is a M&A case in recently. And also for German company, foreign enterprise and foreign policymakers, it does not see the dependence on Russian gas or dependence on Chinese market as a threat. This is weird. So the cruelty of the success of TSMC or Taiwanese semiconductor cannot be reproduced in Europe. This is because the dark side of TSMC, we supply tons of engineers, all of the talents in Taiwan, they go to TSMC, and it doesn't make sense for Europe. And the Europeans, they would not do this. This is basically my presentation. I thank for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. We are now fully updated about the so Taiwan's case too, sort of under the sovereignty fever, with some tools to sort of control the semiconductor trade, through investment, export control, sort of knowledge control, but the value chain, sort of interdependence of the sort of semiconductor ecosystem still is there. Now, may I ask DJ to make comments? Say a little bit less than 50 minutes, perhaps, please.
I'll do my best, Ken. These were very interesting papers. They really present a very interesting set of micro conditions under which one can think about the economic security nexus that I think was part of the framework for this panel. I want to step back a bit to begin by taking a view from 30,000 feet up to try and lay out a couple of the key issues that I see in the economic security nexus, and then try to hone down to some of the things that were said in the papers and raise some questions. Just as a broad background that I think has been picked up in the conference as well, clearly in the period following the 1975 defeat of the United States in Vietnam and the economic reforms of China in 1978, the Indo-Pacific area, or certainly the Asia-Pacific area, as it used to be known, was capable of dismissing in many respects, or disregarding in many respects, or downplaying in many respects, the security concerns that had long baffled individual countries. There was a great turning to the market, to globalization, to increased foreign direct investment, supply chain creation, complicated globalization networks and like, all of which gave rise to a pretty strong belief that if economics was allowed to dominate the discussion, that globalization and supply chain engagement would lead to a path to peace and prosperity. And certainly East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, the United States as well, enjoyed a great deal of both peace and prosperity from roughly 1980 until roughly 2010, which all, I think, gave decreased attention on the part of individual countries to the composition of their specific economies. The interdependence allowed, for example, countries like the United States, the ROK, Japan, to reduce much of their prior strength in manufacturing through foreign direct investment, particularly in China, but also in Southeast Asia. And the US in particular seemed to make up for it by huge gains in finance and services. In essence, the economic logic of free trade seemed to dominate, while the prior zero-sum security concerns and worries about relative power of different countries began to wane. And in essence, we had the belief that absolute gains for all countries would trump the security worries that had previously animated discussions in an awful lot of countries. In effect, in terms of IR theory, liberalism was trumping neorealism or realism. Recent events, of course, as these papers have discussed and as the newspaper headlines have made it very clear, have exposed the limitations of allowing depoliticized economic dominance. We've seen a growing set of tensions between national economic interests and national security interests in at least three big ways that I see as relevant. The first of these is less picked up in these papers and less focused for the discussion, but I think it's important to keep in the back of our minds. And that is the ways in which national economic vulnerability exists to just generic or universal global or supply chain disruptions. For example, the United States and the rest of the world is facing a huge shortage in computer chips that are having major impacts on automobile production, even though these chips are relatively simple, but supply chains have been interrupted. We've seen the pandemic disrupt productions and delivery schedules that have slowed down GDP growth and the like. And of course, the pandemic itself has created a huge security threat, as has global warming. So in all of these ways, I think we need to be very careful about believing that somehow economic incentives will somehow eliminate some of the difficulties that are created by these vulnerabilities in supply chain vulnerabilities, supply chain concentrations, high concentrations of power within very small nodes of the supply chain. And we're becoming increasingly concerned, certainly within the United States, I think within Japan, certainly within China, about the ways in which the relative gains of one country can benefit them in terms of their perceived competition with other countries. The second area of concern with economics and security that I think we need to pay attention to is the one that I think is focused on here in these papers, and that is the ways in which national vulnerabilities exist to dependence on key components that are heavily controlled by a single country that's willing to weaponize its capacity to deprive other countries, particularly a targeted country, of key components in which it has a high concentration of supply, or the targeted country has a high degree of demand. This is a point that was made by Professor Gholz in an earlier paper of his, and I think it's a very good one. And we've seen it play out in terms of the relationship between China and Japan in the depriving of rare earths, the US cutoff of Chien-Huei, the implications for 5G, and the current concerns about Taiwan's security vulnerabilities, which I think were not picked up in the papers that I read or the presentations. Taiwan's vulnerability in security terms, because it is precisely the major producer of these key elements in semiconductors, the most sophisticated chips, and the high-speed computer semiconductors. Today's presentation shed a lot of light on these things, and I'll leave the presentations to stand by themselves, but I think this growing worry about the security implications of economic dependence, particularly with regard to dependence on China, and I think the fears of security for possible Chinese, I wouldn't say invasion, but Chinese economic control over Taiwan or economic strangulation of Taiwan in an effort to gain control of the semiconductor capacity embedded in Taiwan's semiconductor.
Professor Pempel, I just wonder,
yes.
Maybe the level of your voice is not that stable. I just wonder how somehow you can stabilize the level of your voice.
I will do my best to sit closer to the computer, and I apologize in advance. Is that any better, Ken?
Yeah,
or
I think it's
still
better.
sound?
That's good. Thank you very much.
You now have a very good picture of my nose, but it may also allow me to speak a little bit better. The critical question then is how able are affected countries to find replacements for items that are denied them. And market forces may be important in this regard, as Professor Gholz says, but this is also a matter of timing, and it's extremely time-consuming to open a mine for rare earths, or extremely time-consuming to create a new set of foundries for the production of semiconductors. So it's not as though the market is going to be capable of the kind of speedy response that often is demanded in tricky security situations. Finally, the third big area of problems that I think need to be addressed is the one that certainly is animating a lot of discussion in the United States, and that is the difficulty that is being posed by the competition between China and the United States in what China considers to be the major quest for dominance in key manufacturing sectors of high tech, which include things like AI, space, robotics, solar, alternative energies, 5G, et cetera. And this is now creating a dynamic competition between the United States and China, into which other countries are increasingly vulnerable of being sucked or pulled into that vortex. And certainly the United States is particularly fearful now of losing what used to be its economic hegemony and loss of control over key sectors of the global production network that are critical for security, not just for the satisfaction of consumer demands. And this is, I think, what's being played out from the Japanese standpoint that Professor Fukuda talked about with NETI's efforts to set up the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing operations in Kumamoto, or the Professor Wu talked about with the United States getting semiconductor production in Arizona. It seems to me within this context, there are two big broad areas of concern that we need to address going forward. The first of these is just the high risk of global decoupling, of dismantling the global free trade system that was set up in the wake of World War II, and that has been so beneficial to the well-being of so many large portions of the world, and to retreating to economic nationalism. A dose of economic nationalism is probably commonsensical, but there's the risk of going overboard in this regard. And I think when you view this regionally, the issue becomes more than just a play between the United States and China, but it increasingly runs the risk of secondary countries or middle powers like Japan or South Korea being pulled into that vortex and being forced or pressured to make key choices of their own about whether they wish to achieve semiconductor independence, for example, or whether they want to be in a position to develop rare earths or other key components in that distribution chain. And clearly, a lot of these countries are pushing back in the efforts to create and maintain and preserve the global free trade system. Witness the efforts by Japan in particular, Australia, to create and produce CPTPP when the United States pulled out. Witness the development of RCEP, which is also an effort to maintain that global free trade balance. So I think there's really a fundamental tension between security demands and the market demands of globalization and continuing the global supply chains and globalization. And the second big concern that I would just raise is that we now have economic and security links pulling in very different directions. During the Cold War, economic and security interests of countries tended to overlap very heavily. Countries traded with their security partners. They did not trade with their potential adversaries. That is now changing, and we see that with China's trade dominance, trade centrality to the export markets of so many countries across East Asia, most of whom are very reluctant to destabilize those trade links in efforts to somehow challenge the security challenges or to respond to the security challenges posed by China. So it seems to me countries are being pulled in two very different directions. And working out those difficulties is going to be extremely difficult, but it's also going to be extremely difficult to meet the challenge that's posed by China by its efforts to dominate various portions of the of the high-tech industry. We've seen some efforts by the United States and Western Europe to use financial sanctions as a way to offset some of the trade weaknesses, but it seems to me that those are a couple of big areas that we need to think about. Now, in terms of the specific papers, I just want to raise 2 or 3 very quick questions. One central question that I think is posed between Professor Gholz on the one hand and Professors Wu and Fukuda on the other, and that is the question of whether the markets will in fact be capable of meeting what they see as the security difficulties. Certainly Professor Wu talks about the difficulties of the European market responding by creating its own semiconductor industry. Professor Fukuda stressed METI's involvement in trying to develop or recreate or re-stimulate the semiconductor market. Professor Gholz, it seems to me, leans much more in the direction of believing that market forces will be capable of offsetting some of these government efforts, or that many of these government efforts are not necessary. And a second question I want to pose is whether Taiwan semiconductor, being so central to Taiwan's economic prosperity, whether that poses either an unavoidable target for China to increase its efforts to gain control over Taiwan because of Taiwan Semi's critical importance to the overall supply chain of chips globally, or whether in fact Taiwan is better off diffusing some of that centrality by allowing some of its production to be moved abroad. I don't know what the answer to this is, but with people like Professor Wu and Professor Fukuda as experts in that area, I would be interested in hearing them discuss that trade-off. So let me stop on that note, and I look forward to the discussion.
Oh, thank you very much, TJ, for the comprehensive comments. May I just clarify, just really the central points that you're making? You said 3 sets of points. One was about the national vulnerabilities. Was it the first one?
Yes, but these are more, I would call it global vulnerabilities. That is to say, most countries are heavily vulnerable to breaks in the supply chain. For example, as we're seeing now with semiconductors that affect the auto industry, and they affect a whole lot of things, or the slowdown because of the pandemic. So these are what I would call global challenges that affect a lot of countries in very similar ways. They don't pose the same problem that the problems that are faced by these papers raise, which is second point: how do critical components or critical points in the supply chain either allow countries with a high concentration of an industry to use that as a weapon against others, or how does the vulnerability of countries to the disruption of key elements affect them? And then the third point was simply that we're now seeing a move toward economic nationalism as countries that recognize how vulnerable they are in supply chain disruptions lead many of them to try to regain control of key elements. Not everybody can produce rare earths, but certainly more are now trying to do it to decrease the vulnerability that they might have otherwise had to China or other places. So, and that sets up the rivalry, for example, between the US and China. Is that a little bit clearer?
That's really high, well clarified. Now, the Q2 is about the sort of privileged position of Taiwan in the semiconductor sector that makes even more attractive for China, seen from Beijing. The Q1, what was it about security difficulties? May I just ask to clarify the first question? Sorry.
Yes, it was whether countries that are now heavily dependent on China economically will be pulled in very different directions. So nations in East Asia are increasingly finding themselves pulled for security purposes toward the United States, or trying to move away from dependence on China, but their economic interests pull them to China. So it becomes very difficult for countries that are interested in challenging China on anything like economics, trade, high tech, et cetera, to mobilize a global coalition against China because of this. And so countries like Japan, for example, are facing the difficulty of heavy dependence economically on China, with simultaneously very strong fears that China will pose a security challenge. I think the same thing is true of the ROK of South Korea, and South Korea is moving much closer to China, even though that may change with the new administration. But it's that tension between any single country in Asia's pull toward China economically and pull toward the United States in terms of security.
Okay, great.
Sorry.
Thanks for the clarification. May I ask each speaker to respond, perhaps in a reversed order? Dr. Wu, can you start to respond, and then the Eugene and Madoka, please.
Okay, I will start from TSMC or semiconductors. Basically, in my view, I share with the second option, to decentralize or to distribute, to diffuse TSMC and to invest in abroad, either in Arizona, in Kumamoto, or somewhere in Germany or in Czech Republic. I think it is both a better option, both in terms of economic growth and economic prosperity, but also in terms of national security. In terms of economic security or economic prosperities, as I mentioned, we invest a lot of talents, and not to mention that these are a subsidy from lower prices of electricity or low price of land uses or low price of, in fact, it crowded out other disciplines, other enterprise by attracting all young talents into being the engineer in TSMC. This is not good for the domestic economic. But on the other hand, if we invest abroad, if TSMC or Taiwanese semiconductor invest abroad, that would diversify the centrality of Taiwanese semiconductor. I think in this way, it also enhances national security. In terms of the first question, if I have 1 minute, then I would say it's great to see other countries, they are following the step of Taiwan, because we used to have heavily over-dependent on China. And since something like in the past 20 years, we try to diverse, or we try to relocate from China to other places. And since other countries, they are following the step. In this case, we benefit the level playing field compared to South Korea and compared to Japanese enterprise. This is how I see the market and national security dilemma. Okay, thank you.
Great. Please, Eugene, please.
So I'm eager to get to broad conversation. So I'm going to be, very short, which is, I think TJ has correctly deduced my friendliness to markets and my belief in general that there shouldn't be a lot of concern with geopolitical or geoeconomic alleged threats, that this is easily politicized and exaggerated effectively by rent-seeking interests, right? So if you ask the Semiconductor Industry Association in the United States, how much money do they need? They will respond, we need $1 trillion, because they want $1 trillion, not because they really, have a national security problem. And I think that's a lot of what we see happening currently. So, I don't think every country needs a semiconductor foundry. What every country needs is access to semiconductors, and diversified markets. Actually, the market has an incentive to have diversified supply because in all kinds of disruptions, like the global disruptions that you mentioned are weird, right? What was weird about the pandemic is that it affects every country of the world. Most even natural threats, not just geopolitical manipulation, happen. There's a hurricane in one place that disrupts some factories, right? And so having national production only protects you if you can promise, for example, that none of your domestic workers are going to get sick from the pandemic. But you can't, they all get sick. And so national production doesn't matter. What matters is multiple sources that prevent political manipulation. And we're seeing that happen anyway across all of these markets. Enough said for now.
Okay. Madoka, please.
Thank you for Professor Pempel's comments and questions. And for the first point about the this is maybe about the difficulties of decoupling, right? And in Japan, many people discuss maybe more about that than in the United States, I think. And in Japan, many people point that we have to carefully divide strategic products from other high-tech products. And I think many Japanese are cautious about the decoupling with Chinese market, and more comparing with the United States. And the Japanese people also are very cautious about the possibilities of military conflicts in the Taiwan Strait, maybe more than people in the United States. So how can I say so? So Japanese government and the Japanese people always stress the importance of the importance of stating the peace and stability in the region, or peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait to deter the military action of China. And for second point, in Japan, some experts point that the technology that the TSMC has is also very important for mainland China. So for China or Chinese leaders, it is really difficult to take military actions against Taiwan, because if to do so, Chinese how can I say? Because the Chinese semiconductor industries have not catched up to the technology that the TSMC and other Taiwanese company have. So I think the, how can I say, it is possible that TMC's technology work for that China work to deter China to take military action against Taiwan. That's my comments and answer for your question. Thank you.
Good. We still have 7 or 8 minutes to go. There's one question from Yukiko Fukagawa, the speaker from the of the next session too. A question to TJ. She says there was a semiconductor war between Japan and the US in the 1980s. And not only China, but the even other Asian countries learned that the government managed trade ruined Japan's semiconductor industry, though we had our own structural problems. So that is why, despite economic security nexus, still there is strong desire for free trade based on RCEP, CPTPP, and actually it is only the United States who has failed to promote any substantial free trade agreement among major economies. Naturally, still the China's free trade claims look better for Asian countries. There is a follow-up. So my question is how Washington, D.C. can find some comfortable or healthy relations between GVC robustness, global value chain robustness and resilience while committing still to free trade. That is the question from Yukiko Fukagawa. This is to TJ, to the commentator, but anyway, we all discuss. Please, TJ.
That's one of the difficulties of being an American in this global discussion, because it's very hard to defend American activities, and I don't feel I'm representative of the United States in this regard.
Better than being Russians, perhaps. But anyway,
in this regard, I think I find myself in harmony with Eugene. I'm far more dependent on, far more willing to rely on the market than on the government, particularly when it comes to many of these issues of free trade. So I fully agree on the semiconductor situation that the United States, by demanding a specific share of the Japanese market, was completely out of line with its alleged principles of free trade. This was really an effort to salvage the American semiconductor industry, which was being challenged by the Japanese. By the greater efficiency of the Japanese semiconductor industry. So I'm not in favor of that at all. I do think, though, if I can segue to the point that Eugene made, and maybe this is worth discussing as well, it does seem to me that his point about ensuring that countries have access to semiconductors, or whatever the critical element is, rare earths or airplane parts or whatever, is certainly at the heart of much of this issue. But one of the difficulties, I think, is that if a single country gains strong economic dominance of a key node in the supply chain nexus, as Japan did with semiconductors, if it uses that capacity in conjunction with government action to enhance the capabilities of its own national government or its own national economy at the expense of others, and will only provide key goods at inflated prices, and there's low competition in those goods, then it becomes difficult to see how a market solution works. Things just basically become much more expensive. And certainly once a country gains national control of a critical node in the nexus, as say Japan did in semiconductors, or as China has with solar power, for example, it becomes very difficult for other countries to catch up without some version of government intervention. So I'm one of those folks who grew up reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I'm always looking for the medium solution to this. How do you balance off national efforts to ensure that they have access to key elements versus how do you prevent that from going so far overboard that you deny other countries access to items that are critical to themselves? And how do you create how do you prevent monopoly by a single country of key components at the highest ends of technology? That's a very long-winded answer, and as a discussion, I should probably leave it to the panelists to offer their thoughts on this, Ken. So I'll stop.
That's good. That's good. Eugene, would you like to join the conversations?
I would. I mean, it's a good question. I think TJ's answer is a pretty good one, although I'm maybe not quite as Goldilocks and the Three Bears in the end as he is, in the sense that, it depends. You have to pay careful attention to the details of the different sectors and think about really entry barriers, right? So what is it that led to the monopolization of supply by a particular country? Because, I mean, the general problem with any strategy like that, if monopolizing supply and raising prices, is that when prices go up, it stimulates entry, right? And so other countries will just enter the market. And in fact, other countries anticipating the risk that another country will raise prices, or that suppliers in another country will monopolize and raise prices, preemptively enter the market or start to enter, right? So the timing problem you raised earlier is not so acute. So, rare earths is not the great example of everything, but for this, it's pretty good in the sense that investors started to get uncomfortable with Chinese dominance in the market in the early 2000s, a decade before China embargoed Japan with, rare earth exports. And so they were already, it wasn't that they, at the time of the embargo, they had to start from scratch. They had already started investing, figuring out what the resource was like, figuring out the chemistry of processing the resource in both the United States and Australia. And there is a resistance to concentration. Now, there are some markets where it's very hard because of entry barriers, because you can't figure out the technology to start that process or to respond when somebody raises prices in another country. And that's a question, it's one of the debates about semiconductors, right? How possible is it that if something terrible happened to the Taiwanese semiconductor industry, that production elsewhere could increase? And, there is a fair amount of semiconductor capacity in Korea. Maybe that's a possibility. Or the semiconductor manufacturing capability, there's a capital constraint, but do you really think other countries in the United States, you can't find $20 billion to build a fab, buying semiconductor manufacturing equipment from the Netherlands and Japan? Sure, it's going to take a little time. There's going to be futzing. It's going to be a little less efficient at the beginning. But you can see that kind of adjustment happening. And the question is, what is the entry barrier? And is there an entry barrier that for some reason you feel you need the government to overcome? And even in semiconductors, it's going to raise skepticism for me, especially because of the risk of rent seeking. But for lots of other markets, I can't even tell the beginning of a story about an entry barrier. And so I don't worry so much about monopolization in one place because exploitation just stimulates entry.
Okay, we have just exhausted, but the
sorry to filibuster.
Chien-Huei, you raised your hand. Would you like to comment on it?
I just want to comment one final point. The rent seeking between semiconductor enterprise. There's a very strong lobbying influence in US, especially from Intel. This is, semiconductor is not really a big issue for US economic security issues, except military and strategic elements. But the main point here, why semiconductor has become a big issue in US. This has become the lobbying and rent-seeking process, just as Eugene mentioned. I just want to mention this, and I just want to concur on this.
Okay. Well, we may want to continue, but unfortunately time runs out. So I would like to conclude this session by thanking three speakers as well as commentator TJ for the wonderful interventions for this session. Thank you very much. And I also would like to extend my gratitude to Mia and Andrea, who are behind running this session. Thank you very much indeed. Now, those who want to continue to listen to the panel 6, starting in 30 minutes time, you just stay tuned, you just stay on, and all of the panelists now, will disappear and a new one coming in. So just stay. Thank you very much indeed. It's good to see you.